I have walked into archives where the smell of dust carries the weight of memory. Old photographs, brittle newspapers, and the faint shadows of headlines whisper stories the NFL itself often prefers to leave in silence. But in those fragile pages lies a truth. The modern NFL, with all its spectacle, its billions, and its meticulous rulebook, was not created by foresight. It was born in blood. The story of football's rulebook is not one of innovation first. It is one of reaction. Every controversial rule, every dramatic change, is a response to a tragedy that came before it. Behind the dry language of regulations lies a ledger of pain, filled with the names of men who left everything on the field and sometimes never rose again. We often speak of football as America's game. Its rise from college campuses in the late 19th century to today's billion-dollar empire is framed as inevitable. Yet the early decades of football were more akin to organized combat than sport. Players lined up without protective gear, their bodies colliding in formations that resembled war machines. Coaches celebrated toughness to the point of cruelty. And in those years, the line between entertainment and catastrophe blurred beyond recognition. The season of 1905 has become infamous in football history. That year alone, 19 young men lost their lives playing the sport. They died from skull fractures, broken spines, and internal injuries. More than 100 others suffered crippling injuries that would follow them for the rest of their lives. To read the casualty reports is to wonder whether this was a sport or a public execution played out on muddy fields before cheering crowds. President Theodore Roosevelt himself, a man whose own creed glorified rugged individualism and physical toughness, felt compelled to intervene. He gathered the leaders of the nation's top football programs and delivered a blunt ultimatum: reform the sport or lose it forever. Roosevelt's S-words sparked changes, but not enough to erase the legacy of those who had already fallen. The NFL would not officially form until 1920. But its DNA was already written in those tragedies. The rules that shape the modern game trace their origins back to moments of horror, to the sight of lifeless bodies carried off fields, to the wails of families who sent their sons to college only to bury them by winter. The NFL's past is a reminder that every rule we debate today was purchased at a price. Take the story of Harold Moore, a young college player whose death in 1905 became a rallying cry for reform. He was tackled in what newspapers then called a mass play, a brutal strategy that allowed a team to gangroosh defenders in an almost military-style wedge. Moore's skull was fractured. He never regained consciousness. His death was not isolated, but his name appeared in headlines across the country. One of many that forced football's leaders to confront what they had unleashed. The flying wedge, once considered the ultimate show of force and unity, became synonymous with death, outlawed in 1906. It stands as one of the earliest examples of a rule change born of necessity, not out of tactical genius, but as an attempt to keep men alive. And yet, even that ban could not fully tame the violence. The forward pass, that most iconic element of American football, was itself a product of desperation. Introduced in the same year as the wedge ban, it was not welcomed as an elegant new strategy. It was a safety measure, a way to spread the field and reduce the catastrophic pileups that crushed players beneath heaps of bodies. At the time, critics sneered at it, calling it unmanly and unsporting. But survival has a way of reshaping tradition. These were not isolated reforms. They were the beginning of a cycle that has never truly ended. A cycle where bloodshed comes first and rules come after. Consider the haunting stories that repeated themselves across decades. In the 1930s and 40s, when leather helmets were the standard, fractures and fatalities were still routine. It took until 1943 for helmets to be made mandatory, decades after common. Sense would suggest they should have been required. Why? Because resistance to change was rooted in the mythology of toughness. To wear a helmet was, in the eyes of some players and coaches, a sign of weakness. Better to risk death than to appear fragile. Even when helmets were finally required, they became weapons of their own. In the 1950s, coaches encouraged spearing, teaching players to lead with the crown of the helmet in devastating headfirst collisions. For years, the rulebook did nothing to stop it. Only after an epidemic of neck and spinal injuries, some leaving players paralyzed on the turf, did the league finally move to outlaw the practice in the 1970s. But by then, the culture of violence had already been entrenched. Players were celebrated not just for their skill, but for their ability to inflict punishment. Fans cheered when quarterbacks were slammed into the ground, when receivers were clotheslined midair, when blood stained the field. Behind those cheers were lives irreparably changed, and rules that lagged far behind the brutality they sought to contain. The origins of these rules reveal more than just a history of adjustments. They tell the story of a sport that has always lived at the edge of its own survival. The NFL's rulebook is a document written in response to crisis. Each change is a scar left by a wound. And yet, those scars are often hidden. The names of the men who suffered rarely remembered in the broadcasts and highlight reels that celebrate the modern game. When we look back, we see not just moments of tragedy, but patterns of denial. The league, from its earliest days, resisted acknowledging the dangers inherent in its product. Safety reforms were painted as a tax on the essence of football. Coaches insisted that brutality was part of the game's character. Fans echoed the sentiment, valuing toughness above all else. Only when the casualties mounted beyond denial did reforms come, each one too late for those already lost. The irony is undeniable. Today, fans debate penalties for roughing the passer or targeting, often dismissing them as softening the sport. But every one of those penalties has its roots in a body broken on the field. The quarterback protections were born from shattered bones and collapsed lungs. The targeting rules came after players were left motionless on the turf. The Concussion Protocol, imperfect as it is, was forced into existence by lawsuits from men whose lives were destroyed after the cheering stopped. The modern NFL thrives on pageantry and profit. But beneath the surface lies this darker truth. The rules that shape the game are monuments to those who suffered before them. Each one carries a story of someone who paid the price, so that others might play under safer conditions. And yet, the question lingers. Has the NFL ever truly learned, or has it only adapted just enough to survive? The rulebook grows thicker, the penalties more complex, but the cycle remains. Violence leads to tragedy, tragedy leads to reform, and reform leads to controversy. It is a cycle written not just into the sport's history, but into its very identity. This is the story we are about to uncover. How the most controversial rules of the NFL were not created in boardrooms or strategy sessions, but on bloodied fields in broken locker rooms and in the headlines of newspapers, mourning young men gone too soon. This is not the story of football as we cheer for it on Sundays. It is the story of football as it truly is, a game that has always danced with darkness, and a league that has always struggled to reconcile its violence with its survival. Every yard, every whistle, every line in the rulebook has a story. Some are stories of innovation, but most are stories of tragedy, controversy, and reluctant change. The origins of these controversial rules remind us that the NFL has never been just about touchdowns and trophies. It has been about survival. Survival of the sport itself, survival of the players, and survival of a league that rose from the blood and bruises of its earliest days. The dark side of the NFL is not hidden in shadows. It is right there, etched into the rules we watch enforced every week. The rules we argue about as fans, the rules players curse when penalties fly. Each one of them tells us something about the game's past, a past filled with stories that deserve to be remembered. This is that story. When we talk about the NFL today, the conversation often begins with its grandeur. Sunday afternoons and Monday nights bring with them a spectacle of color, sound, and athletic brilliance. Stadiums filled with tens of thousands of fans roar in unison as players collide on perfectly manicured fields under billion-dollar lights. The broadcast angles, the instant replays, and the endless commentary all give the impression of an institution that has always been polished, professional, and permanent. But beneath this carefully cultivated image lies a past that is neither clean nor orderly. The NFL was not born whole. It was forged out of chaos, brutality, and controversy. Its rules, the very foundation of how the game is played, emerged not from foresight, but from the desperate need to survive catastrophe. This documentary is about those origins, about the shadows that linger beneath every penalty flag and every line in the rulebook. It is about how football, from its inception, balanced on the razor's edge between sport and spectacle, between entertainment and carnage. And it is about how the National Football League, as we know it, exists today because of the tragedies that forced its hand. To understand this history, we must go back to the beginning. Football in the late 19th century was not the orchestrated game we recognize today. It was closer to an organized street fight played on college lawns and open fields. The sport evolved out of rugby, and in the process of Americanizing it, rules were stripped, formations were weaponized, and physicality was celebrated with reckless abandon. Teams often lined up in mass formations, their only objective to smash forward with overwhelming force. Helmets were non-existent, padding minimal, and medical attention primitive. Injuries were not an aberration. They were the expectation. By 1905, the crisis could no longer be ignored. That year, 19 young men lost their lives playing football, and more than 100 were seriously injured. Newspapers began openly calling for the game to be outlawed. Mothers warned their sons away from it. Colleges considered bans. The very survival of the sport was in jeopardy. It was in this atmosphere that President Theodore Roosevelt stepped forward. A man who famously celebrated the strenuous life and believed in the virtues of toughness. Roosevelt nevertheless saw the mounting deaths as unacceptable. He summoned leaders from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton to the White House and demanded reforms. Football must reform, or it will be abolished, he warned. His intervention, coupled with mounting public pressure, led to the creation of the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States, later renamed the NCAA, and the first major wave of rule changes designed to reduce fatalities. Among these was the outlawing of the flying wedge, a formation that had been directly responsible for countless injuries and deaths. The rulebook also introduced the forward pass, not as a stroke of genius, but as a safety mechanism, intended to spread players across the field and reduce violent pileups. These changes saved the sport from extinction, but they also revealed a pattern that has continued for more than a century. Reform in football has always been reactive, never proactive. The NFL, officially founded in 1920 as the American Professional Football Association, inherited this legacy. From the moment of its creation, it lived with the tension between spectacle and safety. On one hand, the league needed violence to attract fans. On the other, it needed just enough restraint to ensure players survived the season. Every controversial rule that followed was born out of that contradiction. Take the story of helmets. For decades, players resisted them, claiming they were unnecessary or even cowardly. Helmets were optional until 1943, a shocking fact given the frequency of head injuries in earlier decades. During the 1930s and early 40s, fractured skulls and concussions were so common that newspapers treated them as routine game notes. Only the combination of mounting injuries and the needs of wartime manpower. When the government began to worry about athletes being too damaged for military service, finally pushed the league into mandating head protection. But even then, the helmets of the 1940s and 50s were primitive, offering little real protection and sometimes serving as weapons when players used them for spearing. Other rules followed a similar pattern. The clothesline tackle, which could snap a player's neck, was once celebrated as a dramatic way to halt an opponent in his tracks. It was not banned until repeated injuries made it impossible to justify. The practice of spearing, leading with the crown of the helmet, was not outlawed until the 1970s, even though doctors had long warned of its dangers. In each case, the rulebook changed only after the evidence of harm became too overwhelming to ignore. The NFL's rule controversies have never been limited to safety. They have also reflected the league's struggle to balance fairness, strategy, and entertainment. Consider the introduction of overtime rules after the 1958 NFL Championship game, the so-called greatest game ever played. That contest, which ended in sudden death, was celebrated by fans, but criticized for its randomness. Over time, overtime rules have evolved repeatedly, each iteration sparking debate over whether the league is protecting fairness or simply responding to outrage. Perhaps no single rule embodies controversy more than the infamous tuck rule. Enforced during the 2001 playoff game between the New England Patriots and the Oakland Raiders, what seemed like a fumble became an incomplete pass under a little-known technicality, forever altering NFL history and igniting debates that lasted for years. Though not a safety rule, the tuck rule's legacy demonstrates how deeply rule changes shape the league's story and how controversy is often inseparable from the NFL's identity. What ties these disparate examples together is the principle of reaction. The NFL has rarely led with vision. It has followed with necessity. Rules are introduced when blood is spilled, when lawsuits mount, or when fans erupt in outrage. Behind each controversial regulation lies a history of suffering, and behind every penalty flag lies a forgotten name. This is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a lens through which to view the modern NFL. When fans complain about roughing the passer penalties or targeting calls, when players express frustration with rule enforcement, they are engaging in a debate that stretches back more than a century. It is the same debate that raged in 1905, when critics accused reformers of making the game soft, even as young men were dying on the field. It is the same tension between tradition and survival that has always defined football. Throughout this documentary, we'll explore 15 of the most controversial rules in NFL history, rules whose origins reveal the sport as darkest truths. We will look at the flying wedge, the outlawed formation that symbolized football's early bloodlust. We will examine the forward pass, introduced as a desperate safety measure. We will trace the evolution of helmet mandates, substitution rules, and bans on dangerous tactics like clotheslining and spearing. We will consider modern controversies, from concussion protocols to quarterback protections, and ask whether the NFL is truly safer today or simply better at managing perception. Each of these stories will be told not as abstract regulations, but as human narratives. They are stories of players whose lives and careers were destroyed, of coaches who pushed their athletes beyond human limits, of doctors whose warnings went unheeded, and of fans whose cheers masked the cost of their entertainment. They are also stories of resilience, innovation, and the strange alchemy by which tragedy becomes tradition. As we journey through these 15 chapters, the goal is not merely to recount history, but to uncover the patterns that define it. The NFL's rules reveal a league that thrives on contradiction. It markets violence while policing it. It glorifies toughness while penalizing excess, and it insists on safety only after danger becomes undeniable. The result is a game that is both beloved and despised, both celebrated for its beauty and haunted by its brutality. The NFL is America's most popular sport precisely because it embodies the contradictions of American culture. Our fascination with risk, our tolerance for suffering, and our belief that progress only comes through crisis. This is the heart of the story. The NFL's controversial rules are not side notes. They are the story of the league itself. To understand them is to understand why football is what it is, why it has survived despite its dangers, and why it continues to spark debate with every whistle. And so we begin. There is a moment in football's history that feels more like a military chronicle than a sporting memory. It begins with the pounding of cleats against muddy ground. A roar of voices rising as men lock arms and hurl themselves forward in unison. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like unity, like a wall of force embodying the game's raw spirit. But to those who witnessed it closely, it looked like death in motion. This was the flying wedge, the most infamous formation in early football. First unveiled by Harvard in 1892, it was a tactic designed to overwhelm by sheer physicality. Players sprinted forward, shoulder to shoulder, linked together, building unstoppable momentum. Behind them, another wave of teammates pushed with all their strength, turning human bodies into a battering ram. The wedge was less a play than a declaration. Brute force above all. Contemporary accounts describe the wedge in language more suited to battlefield reporting. Newspaper columns of the 1890s spoke of smashing lines, crushing resistance, and bodies piled in heaps. Defenders caught in its path were rarely knocked aside. They were consumed, trampled, and broken beneath its weight. The formation was devastatingly effective, but its cost was catastrophic. Within just a few years of its introduction, the flying wedge had earned a notorious reputation. Injuries spiked. Broken bones, fractured skulls, and crushed ribs were routine outcomes. In 1894, during a game between Harvard and Yale, observers noted that the wedge left players bleeding and senseless on the field. Coaches and athletes alike knew its dangers, but they also knew its power. Winning mattered more than survival. By the turn of the century, football had become both wildly popular and deeply controversial. College games drew tens of thousands of spectators, yet headlines were increasingly dominated by death counts. The 1905 season proved a tipping point. 19 players were killed that year, many in mass formations resembling the wedge. The fatalities became impossible to dismiss as accidents. They were the predictable result of a system that valued spectacle over safety. One tragic story stands out. Harold Moore, a Union College halfback, died after being crushed in a mass play that resembled the wedge. He was tackled, dragged beneath a pile of bodies, and fatally injured. His death was reported in newspapers nationwide, not as an isolated misfortune, but as evidence of a sport spiraling out of control. Other names soon followed in the obituaries of 1905. Young men from colleges and clubs whose lives ended on the gridiron. Public outrage reached the highest levels of government. President Theodore Roosevelt, himself an admirer of the sport's toughness, convened a meeting at the White House with representatives from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. His message was clear: reform the game or risk losing it forever. Roosevelt's intervention galvanized change, but the pressure had already been building. Educators, physicians, and parents demanded an end to formations like the wedge. In 1906, the flying wedge was officially banned. The new rules prohibited mass momentum plays and introduced the forward pass as a safer alternative. For the first time, football was forced to reckon with the human cost of its strategies. The wedge had been effective, but its efficiency came at a price no longer tolerable to a nation watching young men die. The banning of the flying wedge represents one of the earliest and clearest examples of football's cycle of reform. Tragedy followed by outcry. Outcry followed by rule change. It revealed the sport's reliance on violence for its identity and its reluctance to change until forced by crisis. The wedge was not outlawed because coaches suddenly realized its dangers. Those had been known all along. It was outlawed because the body count became impossible to ignore. Even after its prohibition, the wedge left an indelible mark on the game. The forward pass, legalized as a replacement tactic, would go on to transform football into the aerial spectacle it is today. Yet that innovation was born of desperation, not creativity. It was a direct response to the carnage the wedge had unleashed. The cultural debate surrounding the wedge also set the tone for future controversies. Critics accused reformers of softening the game, robbing it of its manliness. Supporters countered that without reform, football itself would not survive. This same argument would resurface again and again throughout the NFL's history, whenever new rules were introduced to protect players. Toughness versus safety, tradition versus survival. These tensions began with the flying wedge. In retrospect, the wedge embodies the contradictions at the heart of football. It was a strategy of unity and power, yet also one of destruction. It was celebrated for its effectiveness even as it killed. Its banning saved the sport, but only after it claimed too many lives. The wedge was both the pinnacle of early football strategy and the symbol of its darkest excesses. The story of the wedge is more than a historical curiosity. It is the first chapter in the NFL's ongoing struggle with its own nature. Football has always thrived on violence, and yet it has always needed to regulate that violence to survive. The wedge forced the sport to confront that paradox for the first time. And it would not be the last time. From this moment forward, the rulebook became a battleground. Every change would be met with resistance, every attempt at reform dismissed by some as weakness. But the deaths of 1905 and the banning of the wedge proved one thing: football could not escape its dark side. It could only manage it imperfectly, reactively, and often too late. The NFL was still years away from its founding when the wedge was outlawed. But the pattern it set, tragedy sparking reform, would shape the league for the rest of its existence. The rules we argue about today trace their lineage back to that brutal formation and the young men crushed beneath its weight. The wedge is gone, but its lesson remains. In football, progress comes not from foresight, but from bloodshed. When the flying wedge was finally banned in 1906, football stood at a crossroads. The sport had just survived the most existential crisis of its young life. Deaths and injuries had brought it to the brink of collapse, and public opinion was dangerously close to turning against it altogether. Something new had to emerge, not just to save the game, but to reinvent it. That something was the forward pass. It is difficult to overstate how radical the idea seemed at the time. Until then, football had been a grinding contest of collisions, modeled more after rugby than anything resembling the modern game. Progress came only in inches, earned through mass formations and brute force. The ball could not legally be thrown forward, only lateraled or carried. This meant the line of scrimmage was always a battlefield of bodies colliding head-on, with few opportunities for finesse or space. The reformers who gathered after the bloody 1905 season were desperate for a solution. The forward pass offered a way out. By spreading the field and opening the game to creativity, it promised fewer pileups and less carnage. But it was also a gamble. Many doubted whether players and coaches could embrace such a dramatic shift, or whether fans accustomed to violence would accept a style built on speed and precision. The earliest attempts at the forward pass were hesitant, almost awkward. In 1906, St. Louis University, coached by Eddie Kokemes, became one of the first programs to truly embrace the innovation. Led by quarterback Bradbury Robinson, St. Louis stunned opponents by throwing the ball downfield. On September 5, 1906, Robinson completed the first legal forward pass in a game against Carroll College in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Newspapers covered it with astonishment. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch marveled that a new era in football has opened, yet the forward pass was hardly an immediate success. Early rules surrounding it were restrictive, almost as though the reformers wanted to limit its impact. If a pass fell incomplete, it resulted in a turnover at the spot of the throw. If it landed out of bounds, the defense gained possession. Passing was allowed only from at least 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. These limitations discouraged boldness and kept coaches from fully committing to the strategy. Still, the seed had been planted. Some visionaries saw its potential long before it became mainstream. Knute Rockne at Notre Dame would later revolutionize the game by combining the forward pass with clever formations and disciplined execution. His 1913 Notre Dame team's victory over Army is often cited as the game that proved passing could be not just a gimmick, but a legitimate path to dominance. But we must not mistake the romance of innovation for benevolence. The forward pass was not introduced because football wanted to evolve. was introduced because football needed to survive. The deaths of 1905 forced reformers' hands. They searched for a way to reduce the bloodshed without destroying the sport's essence. And the forward pass became their answer. It was a rule born from crisis, a calculated attempt to keep the game alive. The irony is that even as the forward pass promised safety, it created its own controversies. Traditionalists bristled. They accused reformers of turning football into a sissies game, stripping it of the toughness that defined its early years. Players themselves were divided. Some reveled in the new opportunities for creativity, while others felt passing undermined the sport's masculine ideal of trench warfare. And yet, slowly, the forward pass began to reshape football's identity. It opened the field, rewarded agility and vision, and shifted attention from brute force to skill. Where once linemen were the unquestioned heroes, now quarterbacks and receivers began to emerge as stars. Football was evolving into something more cinematic, more theatrical, and far more appealing to audiences. Even so, the forward pass did not eliminate violence. It simply redirected it. Defensive strategies adapted, introducing blitzes, sacks, and crushing hits on vulnerable receivers. In some ways, passing created new forms of danger. The quarterback standing tall in the pocket became a target, his body exposed to defenders charging at full speed. Wide receivers leaping for high throws often came down to earth, with defenders driving into their ribs. The collisions did not disappear. They only changed shape. By the time the NFL was founded in 1920, the forward pass was still a curiosity rather than a staple. The early professional teams leaned heavily on the run, and coaches often viewed passing as reckless. In fact, throughout the 1920s and 1930s, passing attempts were rare, and completions even rarer. Games ended with scores like 6-3 or 7-2, testifying to the run-heavy strategies of the era. It wasn't until the late 1930s and 1940s that the forward pass began to dominate. Legendary figures like Sammy Baugh, the Washington Redskins quarterback, demonstrated just how devastating it could be. Baugh's precision and creativity forced defenses to adapt, and soon the forward pass was no longer an oddity, but the centerpiece of the game. What began as a desperate reform had become football's greatest spectacle. Looking back, the birth of the forward pass encapsulates the paradox of football reform. On the surface, it was about safety. In practice, it became about entertainment. By opening up the field, the forward pass reduced mass injuries and pileups, but it also made the game more dynamic, more thrilling, and ultimately, more marketable. The NFL's rise to dominance in American culture owes much to that innovation. The lesson is clear. In football, every reform has two faces. One face looks backward, toward tragedy, responding to the blood spilled on the field. The other face looks forward, toward opportunity, seizing a chance to reshape the game in ways that enhance its spectacle. The forward pass was no exception. It was born from the horrors of 1905, but it became the foundation of football's modern identity. And yet, hidden within this triumph is a darker truth. The forward pass did not solve football's violence. It merely delayed the reckoning. Decades later, the same cycle would repeat itself. New tragedies, new controversies, and new rule changes would follow. Each innovation would be hailed as progress, but each would also mask the deeper reality. Football's essence remained rooted in collisions, and no rule could ever fully protect its players. The forward pass was a revolution, yes, but it was also the beginning of a long tradition. Reforms introduced not out of foresight, but out of desperation. Football would never again be the same, but its contradictions would remain. The beauty of a perfectly thrown spiral was born out of bloodshed, and the controversies it created were only the first in a century-long struggle to balance spectacle with survival. In the earliest decades of professional football, the quarterback was little more than another body on the field. He called the plays, handed the ball off, and occasionally threw a forward pass, but he enjoyed no special protections. In the eyes of defenders, he was simply another opponent to be hunted down and punished. Brutality was not incidental. It was the point. Defensive players were often coached to hit the quarterback late, to slam him into the dirt, to intimidate him physically until he became hesitant or broken. This philosophy of relentless targeting was woven into the game's culture. Quarterbacks were often smaller men, lighter, and less durable than the linemen and linebackers who sought to destroy them. A successful hit on a quarterback was more than a play. It was a psychological victory. Coaches celebrated it, fans roared for it, and defenses built reputations around it. Yet even in football's violent ethos, the excesses could not go unnoticed forever. By the 1930s, games had become spectacles of not only competition, but cruelty. Quarterbacks left the field bloodied, concussed, and sometimes unconscious. One infamous incident in 1934 involved New York Giants quarterback Harry Newman, who was repeatedly driven into the ground long after plays had ended. "They weren't tackling me," Newman later said. "They were trying to erase me." This was the world in which the concept of roughing the passer first took shape. In 1938, the NFL introduced a penalty specifically aimed at protecting quarterbacks from late and unnecessary hits. The rule was simple in principle. Once a passer had released the ball, defenders could not hit him. In practice, however, the rule was controversial from the beginning. Defenders argued it stripped the game of its toughness, while quarterbacks welcomed it as a measure of survival. Even in its earliest form, the roughing rule was a compromise. Officials often hesitated to throw the flag, wary of disrupting the physical character of the game. Fans booed when it was enforced, accusing referees of softness. But the NFL's leadership saw the bigger picture. By the late 1930s, the forward pass was becoming central to the sport's identity, and quarterbacks were emerging as stars. Protecting them was not only a matter of safety, it was a matter of business. As the decades passed, the roughing rules expanded. The 1940s and 1950s brought more detailed language, forbidding defenders from hitting quarterbacks with elbows, striking them in the head, or driving them into the ground after a release. These changes were met with predictable resistance. Many old-school coaches claimed the league was sanitizing football, transforming it from a warriors' contest into something they derided as powder puff. Defenders grumbled that the rules tilted the field in favor of offenses, making their jobs nearly impossible. But the NFL had made its choice. The quarterback was to be the centerpiece of the spectacle. Protecting him meant protecting the product. The controversy only deepened in the modern era. By the 1970s and 1980s, roughing the passer became one of the most debated penalties in the game. Quarterbacks like Terry Bradshaw, Joe Montana, and Don Marino were not just players. They were faces of the league, and their injuries carried enormous consequences for ratings, revenue, and championships. A late hit that sidelined a star quarterback could derail not only a Team-S season, but also the NFL's carefully cultivated narratives of rivalries and dynasties. In 1979, the NFL banned defenders from striking quarterbacks in the head with their helmets, forearms, or hands. By 1995, the league had outlawed hits at the knees or below. Each of these expansions was justified by medical evidence and high-profile injuries. Yet each was also met with backlash. Linebackers and defensive linemen, already constrained by the pace of the game, felt they were being punished for playing football as it had always been played. Perhaps the most infamous controversy came in the 2000s. As quarterbacks like Tom Brady and Peyton Manning became icons of the modern passing game. In 2008, after Brady suffered a season-ending knee injury from a low hit, the NFL quickly tightened enforcement of rules against diving at the quarterback's legs. Critics accused the league of tailoring rules to protect its most marketable stars, creating what some called quarterback privilege. Defensive players, frustrated, accused the NFL of rewriting the sport to favor offense, entertainment, and ratings. The controversy intensified with the rise of replay technology and slow-motion scrutiny. A sack that looked routine in real time could appear vicious when replayed frame by frame. Flags for roughing the passer began to feel inconsistent, even arbitrary. One game might see a brutal hit go unpenalized. Another might see a defender flagged for little more than brushing a quarterback's helmet with his fingertips. Fans erupted in frustration, complaining that referees were altering outcomes with subjective calls. Yet beneath the noise, the logic remained the same as it had in 1938. Protecting quarterbacks was not only about safety, it was about preserving the league's central drama. The NFL had long since realized that quarterbacks were its most valuable assets. The players' children idolized. Advertisers clamored to feature, and broadcasters built storylines around. Injuries to quarterbacks were bad for business. Rules to protect them, no matter how unpopular, were essential. But the question lingered: at what cost? Did roughing rules compromise the essence of football? Could a game defined by collision and courage survive if its most important players were shielded by layers of privilege? These questions split fans, players, and commentators. To some, the evolution of roughing the passer represented progress, an overdue recognition that safety and survival mattered more than ritualized violence. To others, it was evidence that football was losing its soul. The debate has never gone away. Each season, controversies flare as defenders are flagged for hits that appear clean, while quarterbacks are granted protections unimaginable for other positions. If you touch him, it's a penalty. Baltimore linebacker Terrell Suggs once said in frustration. It's football. At least, it used to be. And yet, the rule endures, expanding further with each generation. In 2018, the NFL introduced stricter enforcement against defenders landing with their full body weight on quarterbacks after a sack. The intent was to reduce catastrophic injuries, but the result was more outrage. Games turned on controversial flags, seasons were altered, and the perception of uneven justice deepened. Still, the truth is unavoidable. Without these protections, quarterbacks would not last. The modern NFL, with its passing-heavy offenses and global spotlight, depends on them. The league's most marketable stars must be protected if the product is to thrive. Roughing the passer may be controversial, even despised, but it is a necessary compromise. This tension between preservation and authenticity, between safety and spectacle, is not unique to the roughing rules. It is the heartbeat of football's history. Every controversial reform begins with tragedy or crisis, is resisted as a betrayal of toughness, and ultimately reshapes the game in ways that secure its future while dividing its past. The roughing rules are more than penalties on a field. They're markers of football's identity crisis, a sport that clings to its violent roots even as it bends to survive. For some, they represent football's betrayal. For others, they are the price of keeping the game alive. And they are only one chapter in a much larger story. For if quarterbacks were the first to be shielded, others would follow. The next frontier of controversy would not be about a single position, but about the very definition of a fair hit. When we picture football today, we imagine the gleam of helmets under stadium lights, icons of toughness, symbols of identity, and emblems of safety. But the helmet story is far darker, and its evolution into one of the most controversial elements of the game reveals yet another layer of the NFL's complicated past. At the dawn of organized football, players wore no helmets at all. The earliest games in the late 19th century were contests of leather skulls against bone and muscle. Head injuries were brutal, and concussions were treated as little more than dazes to be shaken off. Doctors called them head blows, and coaches urged players to tough it out. As one Yale coach put it in 1894, "If you can still walk, you can still play." By the 1890s, rudimentary leather helmets began to appear, often crafted by players themselves or local cobblers. They were crude, little more than padded caps. Their purpose was not to prevent concussions. Few understood concussions at the time. but to protect ears from being torn and skulls from being fractured in open clashes. Players who wore them were often mocked as weak. Too many, the willingness to play bareheaded was a badge of courage. The shift toward helmets as standard equipment was slow. In 1939, the NCAA made helmets mandatory, and by 1943, the NFL followed suit. These early leather helmets were improved, but still far from adequate. They reduced fractures, but concussions remained common. Players often boasted of getting their bell rung multiple times a season. It was part of the culture, proof that you had absorbed football-esque violence and kept playing. The real revolution came with plastic. In 1940, Riddle introduced the first plastic helmet. And by the 1950s, plastic had replaced leather almost entirely. Stronger, lighter, and more durable, plastic helmets promised better protection. They also introduced face masks, which not only shielded players but allowed them to play longer and harder. But with this progress came an unintended consequence. The harder the helmet, the more it became a weapon. Players began to use their heads not just for protection, but as instruments of attack. By the 1960s, the technique known as spearing, leading with the helmet to deliver crushing blows, was commonplace. Coaches taught it, players celebrated it, and fans cheered it. The helmet had not eliminated danger. It had redefined it. The carnage was immediate. Spinal cord injuries spiked. Players collapsed on fields, paralyzed from the neck down. Between 1971 and 1976, more than 30 players suffered catastrophic spinal injuries in high school and college football alone. The NFL, too, saw its share of tragedy. The very equipment designed to save lives was now ending them. The crisis forced the league's hand. In 1976, the NCAA outlawed spearing, and the NFL soon followed. The rule was clear. Defenders could not lead with the crown of the helmet to make contact. Violations were penalized, and repeat offenders risked fines or suspensions. But, like every controversial rule in football's history, enforcement was uneven, and resistance was fierce. Many defenders felt the new rule undermined their identity. Hitting with the helmet had become second nature, a skill ingrained through years of coaching. Changing it was like asking a pitcher to stop throwing fastballs. Even as spearing was outlawed, the helmet continued to create contradictions. Yes, it reduced fractures. Yes, it prevented some catastrophic injuries. But it also gave players a false sense of invincibility. Encased in plastic and padding, they threw themselves into collisions with greater abandon than ever before. The result was not fewer injuries, but different ones. Concussions became the silent epidemic of the sport. For decades, the NFL dismissed or downplayed the risks. Players who suffered repeated concussions were often sent back into games with little more than smelling salts. Trainers called it getting dinged or seeing stars. There was no protocol, no real protection. Helmets, the league insisted, made the game safe enough, but the truth could not be hidden forever. In the 1990s and early 2000s, studies began linking repetitive head trauma to long-term brain damage. The phrase chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, entered the public conversation. Former players like Mike Webster, the Hall of Fame center for the Pittsburgh Steelers, became tragic symbols of what the helmet could not prevent. Webster's brain, studied after his death in 2002, revealed the devastating impact of repeated collisions. He had lived with depression, memory loss, and cognitive decline, all tied to years of head trauma inside a helmet. Suddenly, the helmet was no longer just a symbol of protection. It was a liability, evidence of football's denial. The very piece of equipment most associated with safety had masked the truth. No helmet could stop the brain from rattling inside the skull. The harder the helmet, the harder the hits, and the deeper the damage. The NFL responded with new rules. In 2013, it introduced a ban on crown-of-the-helmet hits across the field, not just in tackling quarterbacks. Any player who lowered his head and struck an opponent with the crown faced a penalty. The league also introduced the targeting rule at lower levels, penalizing hits to the head of defenseless players. Helmets were to be used for protection, not for striking. Once again, outrage followed. Defensive players claimed the rules made it impossible to play. Hall of Famer Ronnie Lott once remarked, "If I had played under today's rules, half my hits would be penalties." Fans, too, voiced frustration, insisting that the NFL was sanitizing the game into something unrecognizable. But the league pressed forward, knowing the stakes were higher than ever. Lawsuits from former players mounted, accusing the NFL of negligence in handling concussions. Billions of dollars were at risk, and so the helmet's paradox deepened. It remained the game's most visible symbol, yet it could no longer be trusted as its ultimate safeguard. Every gleaming helmet on the field carried not only a Team S logo, but also the shadow of controversy. Every rule meant to regulate its use sparked debates about fairness, toughness, and the very soul of the sport. The helmet had begun as a crude leather cap, mocked as cowardly. It had evolved into high-tech armor, celebrated as progress. But in truth, it had always been a double-edged sword. Protection and weapon. Innovation and liability. Savior and betrayer. Football's history with the helmet reminds us of a truth the NFL has wrestled with since its birth. No reform is ever final. Each solution creates new problems. Each innovation brings unforeseen consequences, and each attempt to make the game safer only reshapes the risks. The helmet is not the end of this cycle. It is only one chapter. And as helmets reshaped how players collided, the league was forced to confront another question just as controversial. What counted as a fair hit? From the very beginning, tackling has been football's defining act. The collision of bodies, the crash that stops forward momentum, the contest of strength and will. But just as long as tackling has existed, so too has the question: what is fair and what goes too far? The answer has never been simple, and the evolution of tackling rules reveals the NFL's long struggle to balance violence with justice. In the sport's early decades, fair play was a vague idea at best. Tackles were less about technique and more about force. Players grabbed, yanked, shoved, or slammed opponents to the ground however they could. Clothesline tackles, where a defender swung an arm across an opponent's neck, were common. Horse collar tackles, where a player grabbed the inside of another's shoulder pads from behind, were routine. Piling on after a play had ended was not unusual. The object was not merely to stop the ball carrier, but to punish him for daring to advance. The consequences were predictable. Broken bones, torn ligaments, and concussions were accepted as part of the game. Coaches encouraged it, fans applauded it, and players internalized it. Toughness was measured not only by how many hits you could deliver, but by how many you could survive. If you weren't hurt, recalled one lineman from the 1930s, you weren't playing hard enough. Yet as football grew, as crowds swelled and newspapers chronicled every brutal clash, pressure mounted to define limits. The NFL began by outlawing the most obviously dangerous acts. In 1914, even before the league's founding, colleges banned the clothesline tackle. By the 1950s, piling on became a penalty, signaling that violence after the whistle was no longer acceptable. But the culture was slow to change. Players still prided themselves on intimidation, and many skirted the rules in pursuit of dominance. Enforcement was inconsistent, and referees were often reluctant to penalize hits that seemed in the spirit of the game. The 1970s brought a turning point. Football was faster, players were stronger, and the collisions more devastating. It was also the age of defensive legends: Jack Tatum, Deacon Jones, Dick Butkus, men who turned tackling into an art of intimidation. Tatum, known as the Assassin, once wrote, "I like to believe that my best hits border on felonious assault." His tackles thrilled fans, but horrified critics. especially after his hit on Patriots receiver Darryl Stingley in 1978 left Stingley paralyzed from the chest down. The Stingley tragedy forced the NFL to reevaluate what fair meant. Suddenly, the distinction between a clean hit and a career-ending one became urgent. The league responded with rules against hits on defenseless receivers, late hits, and unnecessary roughness. But each new regulation sparked backlash. Defenders argued that they were being punished for doing their jobs. "What do you want me to do?" one safety complained. "Let him catch the ball and walk away." The controversy deepened in the 2000s, with passing offenses exploding. Receivers were more exposed than ever. The NFL introduced stricter rules. No hitting defenseless players in the head. No launching with both feet off the ground. No striking above the shoulders. These were attempts to reduce concussions and protect players in vulnerable positions. But the rules often left defenders bewildered. Plays that had been celebrated in the past now drew flags and fines. Fans, too, were divided. Some praised the reforms as necessary. Others mocked them as the softening of football. The horse collar tackle became a flashpoint. In 2004, Cowboys safety Roy Williams dragged down Eagles receiver Terrell Owens with a horse collar tackle, breaking Owens' ankle. The injury was a national story, altering playoff races and sparking outrage. By 2005, the NFL banned the horse collar tackle altogether. Once again, defenders accused the league of overreach, but the data was undeniable. Horse collar tackles had caused a surge of lower body injuries. The rule remained. The tension around tackling has never gone away because it cuts to football's essence. The tackle is both the beauty and the danger of the sport. Without it, football loses its soul. But with it, football risks its players. Every attempt to define fair play is an attempt to walk a razor's edge between authenticity and survival. The language of fairness itself is slippery. To an offensive player, fair play means protection, a chance to catch, run, and compete without unnecessary harm. To a defender, fair play means freedom, the right to hit, to intimidate, to impose physical dominance. To referees, it means judgment, deciding in real time where aggression ends and excess begins. And so tackling remains football's most controversial act, a ritual constantly renegotiated. Every rule meant to tame it sparks debate. Every flag thrown for unnecessary roughness fuels outrage. The argument is not really about one hit or one penalty. 'Tis about what kind of game football should be. A violent spectacle of collisions, or a sport that preserves its players for the long term. The truth, as always, lies in the tension. Tackling cannot be eliminated, and it cannot be fully controlled. It is football's heartbeat, but also its hazard. Each new generation of players, coaches, and fans must wrestle with the same questions. How hard is too hard? How much risk is too much? What price is worth paying for the thrill of the hit? The answers shift with time, but the debate never ends. And as tackling rules evolved, another controversy rose alongside them. One not about how to hit, but about how to play the most decisive moments of the game itself. The next battle over fairness would center not on collisions, but on sudden death. The scoreboard is locked. The clock shows 0, and 22 exhausted men stand at midfield with no resolution. For decades, this was not an unusual scene in professional football. Ties were not just possible. They were part of the game's DNA. Fans accepted it, coaches tolerated it, and players moved on. In the early years of the NFL, parity and unfinished business were considered normal. But as the sport grew into America's most-watched spectacle, the notion of inconclusive endings clashed with the very spirit of competition. The question loomed: how should football decide its winners when regulation wasn't enough? The controversy over overtime is more than a story about rules. It is a reflection of football's uneasy relationship with fairness, chance, and spectacle. Few topics in the NFL have exposed such raw philosophical divides. testing how the league balances drama with justice. In the 1920s and 1930s, when the NFL was still an uncertain venture, ties were simply listed in the standings without much thought. Teams crowned champions, despite 3 or 4 stalemates on their record. The 1920 Akron Pros, the first recognized NFL champions, finished with 8 wins, no losses, and 3 ties. No one protested. To the league's founders, it was the cost of doing business in a brutal, unpredictable game. But as the decades passed, ties became less acceptable. Television amplified the issue. By the 1960s, the NFL had become a national obsession, and viewers demanded climactic finishes. Baseball had extra innings, basketball had overtime, hockey had sudden death. Football's inconclusive endings felt archaic, a relic of a less refined era. In 1974, the league made its first bold move: the introduction of sudden death over time for regular season games. The rule was simple: the first team to score would win, no matter the method, no matter how quickly. At first, the drama was undeniable. Overtime injected adrenaline into a sport already built on tension. Fans loved the walk-off victories, the sudden shifts of fortune, the do-or-die stakes with every snap. Players adjusted quickly. Coaches built strategies around it. For a time, the NFL believed it had solved the problem. But underneath the excitement, critics noticed the cracks. Sudden death was not as clean as it seemed. It placed enormous weight on a single coin toss. A flip of metal could determine who got the ball first, and in a game increasingly dominated by high-powered offenses, that advantage was decisive. If the receiving team managed to drive into field goal range, the contest could end before the opponent ever touched the ball. To purists, it was a distortion of the sport's essence. Football prided itself on merit, on the idea that everything must be earned. Sudden death allowed chance to intrude. The flaw became impossible to ignore in January 2010. The NFC Championship game pitted the New Orleans Saints against the Minnesota Vikings. With Brett Favre, then 40 years old, chasing a final shot at the Super Bowl, regulation ended in a tie. Overtime began with the Saints winning the coin toss. Drew Brees led his offense downfield, and after a series of plays, Darrell Hartley drilled a 40-yard field goal. The Saints were bound for their first Super Bowl. Favre never got the ball. Millions of viewers erupted in debate. Was this justice or robbery disguised as finality? The outrage forced the NFL's hand. Within months, the league altered its postseason rules. A field goal on the opening possession would no longer end the game. The opponent would get a chance to respond. Only a touchdown could close the door immediately. It was a compromise, a recognition that sudden death was too unforgiving. Still, controversy lingered. The new system was tested in January 2012 when Tim Tebow and the Denver Broncos stunned the Pittsburgh Steelers. On the first play of overtime, Tebow hit Demaryius Thomas for an 80-yard touchdown. The stadium erupted. The Steelers' offense never took the field. While technically within the new framework, the spectacle raised the same old question. Was it fair for one side's fate to be sealed without a single possession? The issue boiled over again in January 2019. The Kansas City Chiefs faced the New England Patriots in the AFC Championship. The game was tied at 31 after regulation. The Patriots won the toss. Tom Brady, with clinical precision, marched down the field. Rex Burkhead crossed the goal line, and the Patriots punched their ticket to yet another Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes, and the league's most electrifying young star, never touched the ball. Chiefs fans were furious. Neutral viewers agreed. Once again, the coin toss had overshadowed the competition. Public pressure mounted. Analysts declared the system broken. Players voiced their frustrations. We retold all year long that it's about earning everything on the field. One defender remarked, but then it comes down to a coin flip. That's not football. Others disagreed. If your defense can't stop them, you don't deserve to win. argued a veteran lineman. The debate revealed the deeper fault lines in football's culture: offense versus defense, chance versus merit, tradition versus reform. In 2022, the NFL tweaked the rule once more, this time for the postseason. Both teams would be guaranteed a possession no matter what. If still tied, the game would continue under sudden death conditions. It was hailed as progress, but hardly perfection. Critics pointed out that regular season overtime still allowed for the old imbalance, and that guaranteed possessions could drag games longer, heightening risks for players already battered by 4 quarters of violence. The controversy over overtime is not just procedural, it is philosophical. What does fairness look like in football? Is the game about clarity at all costs, or is it about embracing the cruelty of chance? Should the system prioritize drama for fans or justice for competitors? Each iteration of the overtime rule reflects the NFL's attempt to balance those competing values, never quite satisfying both. Overtime also embodies the sport's evolution. In earlier decades, when defenses dominated and offenses struggled for every yard, sudden death felt less arbitrary. Winning the toss did not guarantee victory. But in today's era, with quarterbacks capable of dissecting defenses in minutes, the advantage of the first possession is magnified. The rules that once fit the game no longer align with its speed, strategy, and offensive firepower. For the league, the controversy has no easy answer. Extending games risks injury, but cutting them short invites accusations of injustice. Fans clamor for definitive endings, yet recoil when randomness decides them. Ties are now seen as unsatisfying, even un-American. The NFL's rulebook, revised again and again, reflects its struggle to reconcile these contradictions. What remains constant is the unease. Walk-off victories thrill the crowd, but leave opponents devastated by the sense of incompleteness. Playoff heartbreaks linger in memory, not only because of the loss, but because of how they happened. Overtime has become more than a rule. 'Tis a mirror reflecting football's contradictions. Its brilliance, its cruelty, its power to exalt, and its capacity to wound. And if overtime asked how football should end, the next controversy would cut even deeper. How should football be judged in real time? When the game's most pivotal moments hinge not on players, but on the men in stripes, the battle over fairness grows even more combustible. Football has always prided itself on toughness, precision, and merit. But beneath the helmets and shoulder pads lies an unavoidable truth. The outcome of a game is not always decided by players. Sometimes it comes down to the whistle. A single decision or indecision by referees has the power to shift legacies, rewrite history, and spark controversies that haunt the sport for decades. The authority of the referee has always been both sacred and fragile. On one hand, officials are entrusted with upholding fairness in a sport defined by chaos and violence. On the other, their human judgment introduces subjectivity into a game built on inches and absolutes. This contradiction has produced some of the NFL's darkest controversies. Moments when fans, players, and historians were forced to ask whether the game itself had been compromised. Perhaps no example looms larger in the modern era than the tuck rule game. January 19, 2002. Snow was falling heavily in Foxborough as the New England Patriots faced the Oakland Raiders in the AFC Divisional Playoff. Late in the fourth quarter, with Oakland leading 13-10. Patriots quarterback Tom Brady dropped back to pass. Charles Woodson, his former Michigan teammate, blitzed off the edge and hit Brady, knocking the ball loose. The Raiders recovered, seemingly sealing their victory. But then came the flag. Referees huddled and invoked a little-known technicality: the tuck rule. According to its wording, if a quarterback began a throwing motion and then attempted to pull the ball back toward his body, any subsequent fumble would be ruled an incomplete pass. To the astonishment of millions watching, officials overturned the call. The Patriots retained possession. Minutes later, Adam Vinatieri drilled a 45-yard field goal through a blizzard to tie the game. In overtime, he kicked the winner. New England advanced, and their dynasty was born. For Raiders fans, it was nothing short of theft. "We got robbed," Charles Woodson said years later, still incredulous. Even Brady himself admitted in hindsight that the call felt strange, almost artificial. The controversy underscored the immense power referees held. A single interpretation of a vague rule had altered the NFL's trajectory, elevating one franchise to glory while consigning another to heartbreak. But the tuck rule was not an isolated incident. Time and again, officiating has found itself at the center of scandal. The 2018 NFC Championship game between the Los Angeles Rams and the New Orleans Saints stands as one of the most infamous. With less than 2 minutes remaining and the score tied at 20. Saints quarterback Drew Brees threw a pass to Tamili Lewis. Rams cornerback nickel Robey-Coleman launched into Lewis well before the ball arrived, delivering a helmet-to-helmet hit that was blatant to anyone watching. The flags never came. The no call stunned the Superdome into silence. Instead of first-hand goal, the Saints were forced to settle for a field goal. The Rams tied the game on the ensuing drive, then won in overtime. Outrage erupted nationwide. Even neutral fans saw it as a travesty. The NFL admitted afterward that the officials had erred. Saints head coach Sean Payton revealed that league officials had privately apologized, but apologies did not undo the damage. New Orleans, denied a fair chance at the Super Bowl, carried the bitterness for years. Lawsuits were even filed by fans, arguing that the no call had undermined the integrity of the sport. Incidents like these fuel a persistent perception that referees, whether through incompetence or bias, wield too much influence. Studies have even suggested that subconscious factors, crowd noise, market size, star players affect officiating. Analysts have noted how home teams receive favorable calls in crucial moments, or how star quarterbacks are protected by roughing the passer penalties while journeymen are left vulnerable. These trends might not always be intentional, but they shape outcomes nonetheless. The NFL has responded by embracing technology. Instant replay was introduced in 1986, removed in 1992, and then reintroduced in 1999 with expanded scope. The goal was to correct egregious mistakes, to use video evidence where human eyes failed. Over the years, replay review has grown into a central feature of the game. Coaches challenge calls, referees jog to sideline monitors, and fans wait in suspense for decisions announced in booming stadiums. Yet, replay has not solved the problem. It has only shifted it. Slow-motion footage can clarify some calls, but others remain maddeningly subjective. What constitutes a catch? What defines pass interference? Is a quarterback's hit legal or roughing the passer? These questions spark endless debates, even with technology. The league has tried to legislate precision into existence, but precision is elusive in a sport built on collisions measured in milliseconds. The refereeing controversies also expose the NFL's larger tension between spectacle and integrity. Fans crave drama, but they also crave justice. When calls feel inconsistent or manipulated, trust erodes. The idea that games might be fixed, once whispered on the margins, becomes a louder suspicion. Even without corruption, incompetence can feel indistinguishable from malice. Players, too, carry scars. Careers are defined not just by performance, but by moments where a call swung history. Ask Saints veterans about the 2018 no call, and the anger is still raw. Ask Raiders veterans about the tuck rule, and the bitterness remains. These are not just blown calls. They are moments where the balance of fairness tilted, leaving legacies forever altered. What lingers is a fundamental question. Can football ever escape the imperfections of officiating? Technology can aid judgment, but it cannot erase subjectivity. Human error will always seep through, shaping outcomes in ways no one can predict. The NFL can refine rules, expand replay, or even experiment with centralized officiating from league headquarters. Yet the truth remains: as long as whistles are blown by humans, controversy is inevitable. And as officiating scandals mounted, they revealed a deeper, darker truth about the sport. Rules alone could not guarantee justice, because football itself was structured on imbalance. The next chapter of controversy would show how even the most basic elements of play, like the rights of kick returners, could expose the tension between danger, fairness, and survival. The kick drifts high into the sky, spinning end over end as the coverage team races downfield. Tens of thousands of fans hold their breath as the returner sets his feet beneath the descending ball. In that moment, he is utterly vulnerable. Eyes locked upward, body exposed, defenders barreling toward him at full speed. The crowd knows what's coming. The returner knows what's coming. And for decades, the violence of that collision was considered part of the game's fabric. The fair catch rule, one of football's most peculiar yet essential safety measures, was designed to protect returners in precisely this situation. It grants the returner the right to signal by waving his arm, thereby forfeiting the opportunity to advance the ball in exchange for protection from a hit. On paper, the rule is simple. In practice, it has been one of the sport's most controversial and most revealing regulations, embodying the NFL's perpetual struggle between spectacle and survival. The origins of the fair catch trace back long before the NFL, in rugby and early forms of American football. The concept of granting a player safe passage when fielding a kick was seen as both practical and gentlemanly. But as professional football took root in the 20th century, gentility was often overshadowed by brutality. Returners were prized for their daring, their willingness to risk everything for the chance of breaking a long run. Coaches demanded courage, fans demanded excitement, and players often ignored the fair catch signal altogether, even when it meant stepping into the jaws of danger. The risks were obvious. With eyes focused skyward, returners were prime targets for devastating hits. Some of the most bone-jarring collisions in football's history occurred on punt returns. Helmets cracked, bodies crumpled, and careers ended in an instant. Yet for years, such violence was not only tolerated, but celebrated. Highlight reels showcased returners being flattened, crowds roared at the spectacle, and the players who delivered the hits were lauded as enforcers of the game's unwritten code. But the price was steep. Head injuries, broken ribs, shattered collarbones. The carnage mounted season after season. Medical reports began documenting the disproportionate risk to return specialists. By the 1970s, as awareness of player safety grew, the fair catch rule began to draw more attention from league officials. Still, its enforcement was inconsistent, and its cultural acceptance remained lukewarm. Too many, calling a fair catch, seemed cowardly, a betrayal of football's warrior ethos. The debate crystallized in the 1980s and 1990s as returners like Brian Mitchell, Deion Sanders, and Devin Hester electrified audiences with breathtaking runs. Every punt became a potential highlight, every kick an invitation to chaos. But with those moments of brilliance came equally violent consequences. Returners absorbed some of the hardest hits in the sport, their careers shortened by the very risks that made them legends. Coaches faced a constant dilemma: encourage their players to gamble for field position, or teach them to live another down with a fair catch. The NFL's struggle with the fair catch also reflected larger tensions in the game's identity. On one hand, the league thrived on spectacle. Long returns were among football's most thrilling plays, capable of swinging momentum in an instant. On the other, the league could not ignore the mounting toll of injuries. By the early 2000s, as lawsuits from former players highlighted the devastating long-term effects of concussions, the fair catch became more than a tactical choice. It became a matter of survival. Rule adjustments followed. Kickoffs were moved forward to reduce the number of returns. Coverage formations were altered to minimize violent collisions. In 2018, the NFL expanded the fair catch to kickoffs as well, allowing players to signal within the 25-yard line and automatically place the ball at that spot. The move was intended to reduce the most dangerous play in football, the full-speed sprint of 22 men converging on a single collision point. Yet, controversy persisted. Critics argued that these changes diluted the game, stripping away one of its most exciting elements. Special teams coaches, whose strategies revolved around returns, lamented the shrinking role of their units. Fans complained that the rule encouraged conservatism, robbing them of the thrill of seeing a returner dance through tacklers. To them, the NFL was sanitizing itself, neutering the very chaos that made it irresistible. Returners themselves expressed mixed feelings. Some valued the protection, knowing the risks of a career-ending hit were never far away. Others bristled at the perception that calling for a fair catch was weak. "You, Dan T., make it to the NFL to wave your hand and quit on a play," one return specialist remarked. "You're there to change the game." The culture of toughness, ingrained for generations, continued to clash with the league's attempts at reform. The controversy also underscored an uncomfortable truth. The NFL often acted only after crisis. Safety changes were rarely proactive. They were reactive, triggered by public outrage, high-profile injuries, or legal threats. The fair catch was no exception. Only when the dangers became impossible to ignore did the league elevate its importance. And even then, the rule remained contested, a symbol of football's uneasy compromise between survival and spectacle. What the fair catch revealed most clearly was the vulnerability of the returner. In a game built on collisions, no player was more exposed. The image of a lone athlete, eyes tilted skyward as a swarm of defenders closed in, captured the essence of football's danger and drama. Protecting that player meant protecting the integrity of the game itself. Failing to do so meant accepting carnage as entertainment. The league's evolution of the fair catch rule showed that even small gestures of protection were fraught with cultural resistance. Football's mythology had long glorified risk, toughness, and sacrifice. Rules that encouraged caution were cast as unmanly as a retreat from tradition. Yet as medical science advanced, the costs of that tradition became undeniable. Each concussion, each shattered career, each lawsuit filed by a broken veteran underscored the stakes. The fair catch debate continues today, a microcosm of the NFL's larger struggle. How much safety is enough? How much risk is too much? Fans crave explosive plays, but they also recoil at the sight of stretchers on the field. Coaches want competitive edges, but they cannot ignore the human toll. Players themselves remain caught in the middle, torn between the desire to dazzle and the need to endure. And as the league tried to walk that tightrope, it found that protecting returners was only one piece of the puzzle. The deeper crisis, one that would shake the very foundation of football, was about more than a single position or a single rule. It was about the growing recognition that the sport's most iconic feature, the helmet, might be doing more harm than good. In the earliest days of professional football, the helmet was little more than a strip of leather, a token gesture towards safety rather than a true barrier. Against impact. Players of the 1920s and 1930s wore them as much for appearances as for protection. The hits were raw, the collisions unrestrained, and concussions were brushed off as getting your bell rung. But as the game evolved, so too did the helmet. By the 1950s, plastic shells became standard. They looked like progress, a step toward modernity, a sign that the NFL was adapting to a more violent, faster game. Yet hidden inside this technological leap was a paradox. The sturdier the helmet became, the more it encouraged players to use it as a weapon. By the 1970s, spearing had entered the football lexicon. Defensive players lowered their heads, launching helmet first into opponents with devastating force. Coaches didn't discourage the tactic, they taught it. Players were praised for being headhunters, enforcers who intimidated with bone-rattling blows. Highlight reels celebrated the violence. The sound of plastic cracking against plastic, echoing like gunfire across Sunday afternoons. The cost, however, was catastrophic. medical reports showed alarming increases in spinal injuries, fractured skulls, and long-term neurological trauma. Some players were paralyzed instantly on the field. Others walked away only to suffer devastating consequences years later. But in an era when toughness defined identity, these warnings were often ignored or dismissed. It wasn't until 1976, after a series of catastrophic neck injuries, that the NCAA and NFL took their first steps toward reform. The anti-spearing rule banned players from using the helmet as the primary point of contact. In theory, it was a watershed moment, an acknowledgement that the helmet could no longer be a weapon. In practice, enforcement proved difficult. The culture of the game was steeped in aggression, and referees hesitated to penalize hits that had long been celebrated. The 1980s and 1990s brought a new generation of defensive legends. Players like Ronnie Lott, Steve Atwater, and Lawrence Taylor, who delivered punishing blows that thrilled fans and terrified opponents. ESPN's Jacked Up segment glorified the most violent collisions of the week. Stadiums erupted when receivers were knocked unconscious across the middle. To the casual fan, these were football's defining moments. To the players lying motionless on the turf, they were career-altering events. Behind the scenes, medical evidence mounted. Concussions weren't minor inconveniences. They were brain injuries with cumulative effects. Retired players began speaking out, describing memory loss, depression, and cognitive decline. The phrase chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, entered the public conversation. What had once been dismissed as anecdote was now undeniable science. The NFL's response was slow, cautious, and often defensive. For years, league officials downplayed the risks, even forming a committee that disputed independent research. But the stories of fallen players, men like Mike Webster, Jr. So, and Dave Durson, forced the issue into the national spotlight. Each tragic case peeled back another layer of denial. Helmets, once hailed as saviors, were now symbols of betrayal. By the late 2000s, public pressure had reached a breaking point. Lawsuits piled up. Parents began questioning whether to allow their children to play football. The very future of the sport seemed at stake. In response, the NFL began instituting stricter rules against head-to-head contact. The Defenseless Receiver rule was introduced, penalizing hits to players who couldn't protect themselves. Helmet-to-helmet contact became a flag, a fine, and often a suspension. The most sweeping change came with the introduction of the targeting rule. Borrowed in concept from college football, targeting penalized any hit delivered with the crown of the helmet or directed at an opponent's head or neck. Officials were given broad discretion, and replay review became a tool for enforcement. For the first time, intent was scrutinized, and player safety became an explicit priority. The backlash was immediate. Defenders argued the rules made their jobs impossible, stripping the game of its physical essence. Coaches complained about inconsistent enforcement. Fans decried the decline of real football, claiming the NFL was becoming soft. But for every critic, there was also recognition. Something had to change. The toll of head trauma was too severe to ignore. Archival footage slowed replays of devastating helmet-to-helmet hits, juxtaposed with scenes of players on the sideline, dazed and staggering. The evolution of targeting rules also reshaped strategy. Defenders were forced to adjust tackling techniques, aiming lower, wrapping up rather than launching. Coaches emphasized "see what you hit," teaching players to keep their heads up to reduce risk. The process was uneven, with penalties often marring critical moments, but the culture was shifting. Perhaps most telling was the response from players themselves. While some resented the restrictions, others admitted the rules extended their careers. Former enforcers spoke candidly about their regrets, acknowledging the damage they had inflicted and endured. Younger players, raised in the era of concussion awareness, began to see the game differently. Yet, even with reforms, the paradox of the helmet persists. The same device designed to protect remains capable of inflicting harm. Technology has improved. with advanced padding, impact sensors, and even experimental soft-shell designs. But no helmet can fully eliminate the risks of brain trauma. The very act of playing football, with its speed and collisions, ensures that danger will always remain. The targeting rule is not a perfect solution. It has sparked controversy, altered legacies, and continues to divide opinion. But it represents something larger: the NFL's reckoning with its violent past. For decades, the league glorified headshots as badges of honor. Now, it finds them, flags them, and warns against them. The helmet, once football's proudest symbol of toughness, has become its most complicated artifact. It embodies the sport's evolution, from leather to plastic, from weapon to liability. And as the NFL continues to grapple with the consequences, one truth remains unavoidable. The game's survival depends on finding a balance between the spectacle of collision and the sanctity of the human brain. But as the league tightened rules around helmets and headshots, another controversy simmered. It wasn't about what players wore or how they tackled, but about what the league itself allowed to happen, even when the danger was hiding in plain sight. A controversy born not on the field of play, but in the stadium skies. When the NFL embraced artificial turf in the 1960s and 1970s, it was heralded as innovation, a futuristic answer to football's age-old problem: grass. Natural fields wore down quickly, turned into mud pits in the rain, froze solid in northern winters, and required enormous upkeep. Artificial turf seemed like a miracle. It was uniform, durable, and modern. It fit the image of a league that wanted to present itself as America's game in an era of technological progress. But as with so many changes in football's history, the promise of progress came with hidden consequences. Artificial turf did not simply change how the game looked, it changed how the game was played, and how the game hurt. Players quickly noticed the difference. The surface was unforgiving, hard underfoot, and slick when wet. Tackles that would have ended with a slide on grass now ended with bodies skidding across. What was essentially industrial carpet laid over concrete? Turf burns became common, raw abrasions that tore through skin. But the most serious danger was hidden deeper: the way artificial turf magnified impact. Former players have described the feeling of being slammed onto turf as being dropped on a parking lot. Knees, ankles, and spines absorbed the shock. Ligaments stretched and tore. Bones fractured under the unrelenting hardness. In the 1970s and 1980s, as teams like the Houston Oilers, Philadelphia Eagles, and Cincinnati Bengals adopted turf, injury reports began to reflect the toll. ACL tears, ankle sprains, and career-shortening knee problems rose alarmingly. The surface also altered the speed of the game. On turf, players could cut more sharply, accelerate more quickly, and hit with greater momentum. Receivers ran cleaner routes. Defenders closed gaps faster. The artificial acceleration made the game more dynamic, but also more dangerous. A hit delivered at an extra step of speed could mean the difference between a tackle and a torn ligament. Some players voiced their anger publicly. Hall of Fame quarterback Fran Tarkenton once remarked that turf would shorten careers. And countless linemen who bore the brunt of trench warfare on these surfaces agreed. Yet the league pushed ahead. Stadium operators touted turf's cost efficiency and weather resistance. Television executives loved the pristine appearance, a field that stayed perfectly green through December snow or November rain. Progress had a price, but in the calculus of the NFL, it was a price worth paying. By the 1990s, criticism of artificial turf was impossible to ignore. Studies began to confirm what players had been saying for years. Injury rates were higher on turf than on grass. A 1993 American Journal of Sports Medicine report found that NFL players were significantly more likely to suffer ankle sprains and ACL injuries on artificial surfaces. These weren't isolated complaints, they were systemic. And then came the stories of careers cut short. Running backs whose knees gave out before they turned 30. linemen whose joints swelled so badly after games that they could barely walk, wide receivers whose speed deserted them after repeated ankle injuries. Turf was marketed as a surface of the future, but for many athletes, it felt like a betrayal, a trapdoor beneath their cleats. In response, the NFL didn't abandon turf. Instead, it reinvented it. AstroTurf, the brand that had become synonymous with the problem, was replaced with newer generations of synthetic fields. These were marketed as softer, using rubber pellets to mimic the give of natural grass. Stadiums across the league adopted them, calling the technology player-friendly. But again, reality proved more complicated. While the newer turf reduced some injuries, problems persisted. Players complained about excessive heat, with surface temperatures on synthetic fields soaring above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Rubber pellets got into eyes, mouths, and wounds. Some medical researchers even raised concerns about long-term health effects of the materials themselves, though findings remained inconclusive. The tension around turf mirrored the NFL's larger struggle with safety. On one hand, the league wanted faster, more explosive games to satisfy fans and television networks. On the other, players' bodies bore the cost of those innovations. Artificial turf was not just a surface. It was a symbol of the league's willingness to sacrifice health in pursuit of spectacle. Even today, the debate continues. Modern stadiums like SoFi in Los Angeles and MetLife in New Jersey use synthetic turf, while others, like Lambeau Field in Green Bay, maintain hybrid systems that combine grass with artificial fibers. Players' unions have consistently pushed for natural grass, citing lower injury risks. In 2022, the NFL Players Association called for the league to eliminate turf altogether, arguing that the data was clear. Grass was safer. The NFL has resisted sweeping change, pointing to logistical challenges, weather conditions, and costs. Yet each high-profile injury on turf reignites the controversy. When stars like Odell Beckham Jr. or Aaron Rodgers fall victim to non-contact injuries on artificial surfaces, the conversation resurfaces with renewed urgency. Fans, players, and analysts alike ask the same question. How many careers must be sacrificed before the league acknowledges the true cost of its progress? Artificial turf may never fully disappear. It represents a compromise between economics, optics, and tradition. But its legacy is one of unintended consequences. What began as a symbol of modernization has become a reminder of how easily the NFL, as pursuit of spectacle, can outpace its commitment to safety. And as the league grapples with surfaces beneath players' feet, it must also reckon with something even more elusive: the unseen authority that decides how the game unfolds. Because the rules of football are not only shaped on the field, but also behind closed doors in the judgment of officials, and in the controversial tool the NFL introduced to correct them. For as long as football has existed, it has been a game of inches, where the line between victory and defeat can be as thin as a blade of grass. And for decades, those inches were judged not by machines, not by slow motion, but by human eyes. Referees running across muddy fields with whistles and flags were the final authority. Their decisions were swift, often subjective, and always final. But human judgment carries flaws. A ball spotted a yard too short, a toe believed to be out of bounds, a fumble ruled incomplete. These moments changed seasons, altered careers, and defined legacies. The controversy surrounding officiating was not new. Fans shouted, coaches fumed, and players cursed. Yet, for most of football's history, the sport accepted human error as part of the game's character. That began to change in the 1970s as television transformed football into a national spectacle. Suddenly, millions of fans at home saw replays in slow motion, angles referees on the field never had. The camera became an unforgiving witness, exposing mistakes, magnifying injustices. A missed call was no longer confined to the stadium. It was broadcast, debated, and replayed endlessly across the country. One of the most famous examples came in 1979. when the Houston Oilers faced the Pittsburgh Steelers in the AFC Championship game. Late in the fourth quarter, Oilers receiver Mike Renfro appeared to catch a touchdown in the back of the end zone. Television replays showed him with both feet in bounds, but the officials ruled the pass incomplete. Without replay review, the call stood. The Oilers lost, and the controversy became a national debate. Fans and analysts alike asked, how could a billion-dollar sport allow such obvious mistakes to decide championships? By the mid-1980s, the NFL experimented with technology. In 1986, it introduced its first version of instant replay review. Coaches could challenge certain calls, and a replay official in the press box had final authority. It was revolutionary, but also clumsy. The system was slow, the technology limited, and the rules unclear. Critics complained that replay interrupted the game's flow, drained emotion, and still failed to deliver consistent results. After years of frustration, the NFL scrapped the system in 1992. Yet the demand for fairness never disappeared. By the late 1990s, advances in broadcast technology made the absence of replay untenable. Every Sunday, television networks showed fans crystal-clear images of missed calls, eroding trust in officiating. In 1999, the league reintroduced instant replay. This time with a more structured system. Coaches were given red challenge flags, each team allowed 2 per game. Referees would consult a replay monitor on the sideline, reviewing the evidence to confirm or overturn calls. The return of replay was both celebrated and divisive. Supporters argued it brought accountability and justice. Detractors insisted it undermined the authority of referees and bogged down the game. Still, instant replay became a fixture, evolving year after year. The rules expanded to include scoring plays, turnovers, and eventually, every play subject to review in the final 2 minutes of each half. But with progress came new controversies. The process of the catch became infamous in the 2000s and 2010s. As replay dissected receptions frame by frame. Was Calvin Johnson's 2010 touchdown truly complete before he placed the ball on the ground? Did Dez Bryant make a football move in the 2014 playoffs? Fans watched in frustration as replay, meant to bring clarity, often delivered confusion. A rule designed to prevent mistakes instead created new debates, twisting the definition of a simple act. Catching the ball. Other infamous moments highlighted replay's limitations. In the 2019 NFC Championship game, the Los Angeles Rams benefited from one of the most egregious missed calls in NFL history. A blatant pass interference not flagged by officials. Replay could not review it under existing rules. Public outrage was swift and fierce. The NFL responded by temporarily allowing pass interference reviews, only to abandon the rule a year later after chaotic enforcement. Instant replay had become both a savior and a scapegoat. It corrected undeniable errors. A foot clearly in bounds, a knee clearly down. But it also magnified the game's gray areas. Football is a sport of chaos, played at speeds cameras struggle to capture, governed by rules that leave room for interpretation. Technology promised certainty, but in many cases, it delivered only more angles for debate. And yet, replay revealed something deeper about the NFL. It exposed the tension between tradition and progress, between the purity of the game and the demand for absolute fairness. Football, at its core, thrives on emotion. The roar of a touchdown, the agony of a turnover. But in the replay era, every celebration is tempered by a pause. Every heartbreak delayed by review. The game no longer belongs solely to the players on the field, but also to the camera and the booth. Critics argue that this shift has sterilized football, turning spontaneous joy into procedural wait times. Supporters counter that, without replay, the league's credibility would collapse in a world of endless broadcast scrutiny. Both sides are correct. Replay is neither purely good nor purely bad. It is necessary, and it is flawed. Perhaps the true significance of replay lies not in the calls it corrects, but in what it symbolizes. Football, once a game defined by human instinct, has become a game defined by evidence. The NFL, forced by controversy and public pressure, opened the door to technology, and in doing so, admitted that its human officials could not be trusted alone. That was a cultural turning point as much as a logistical one. The quest for justice on the field continues to evolve. High-definition cameras, digital tracking chips in footballs, and advanced replay centers in New York promise ever greater accuracy. But no matter how advanced the technology, the same debates endure. What is a catch? What is interference? What is fair? Replay may never resolve these questions fully, because at its core, football is a game of interpretation as much as execution. Still, one truth is undeniable. Instant replay reshaped the NFL. It changed how games are decided, how fans experience football, and how history remembers it. The battle over fairness, once fought only in shouts and boos, now unfolds in pixels and frames. Now, the game's most controversial rule is no longer about what players can or cannot do, but about whether the truth can ever be fully captured. And while replay transformed the judgment of plays, another controversial rule struck at the heart of football's most dramatic moments: the sudden death finish, where one coin toss could decide the fate of entire seasons. In football, nothing carries more weight than the final whistle. 60 minutes of struggle, sacrifice, and collision distilled into a single moment of resolution. But what happens when 60 minutes are not enough? When two teams remain deadlocked, unwilling to surrender, and the game spills into the fragile territory of overtime. For decades, the NFL's answer was as stark as it was controversial. Sudden death. Introduced in 1974, the sudden death overtime rule was designed with simplicity. The first team to score wins. A coin toss decided possession, and from there, a single drive could determine everything. On paper, it seemed fair. Football is a game of execution, after all, and sudden death promised drama. Every play in overtime carried the weight of finality. Every snap, a chance to end it all. But as the years passed, cracks emerged in the system. The coin toss, a flip of metal, not a feat of skill, became disproportionately powerful. Statistics showed that the team winning the toss often won the game, sometimes without the opponent ever touching the ball. Fans and players alike began to question, could a season or even a championship really be decided by luck? The controversy came to a head in high-profile moments. In the 1998 playoffs, the Minnesota Vikings, a powerhouse team led by Randy Moss and Randall Cunningham, lost to the Atlanta Falcons in the NFC Championship. After regulation ended in a tie, the Falcons won the toss, drove down the field, and kicked a field goal. The Vikings offense, one of the most explosive in league history, never saw the ball again. 10 years later, the outcry grew louder after the 2009 NFC Championship game between the New Orleans Saints and the Minnesota Vikings. Brett Favre, at 40 years old, had led Minnesota into overtime, only to watch helplessly from the sideline as Drew Brees and the Saints marched down the field for a game-winning kick. For millions of viewers, the sight of one of the greatest quarterbacks in history denied even a chance felt like injustice. The breaking point came in 2010 when the league voted to modify sudden death for playoff games. Field goals on the opening drive would no longer be enough to win. Both teams would be guaranteed possession unless the first drive ended in a touchdown. It was a compromise, a recognition that fairness demanded more balance, but also that the game needed to preserve urgency. Yet even with the new rules, controversy persisted. The most glaring example came in the 2018 AFC Championship game between the Kansas City Chiefs and New England Patriots. Patrick Mahomes, the rising superstar of the league, had dragged Kansas City back from the brink, forcing overtime against Tom Brady's dynasty. The Patriots won the coin toss. Brady drove down the field, and the game ended without Mahomes ever touching the ball. For many, it was déjà vu. proof that the NFL still hadn't solved its overtime dilemma. The public pressure was immense. Commentators called for reform. Players' unions demanded fairness. Fans insisted that both teams should always have a chance with the ball. In 2022, the league finally expanded its overtime rules for the postseason, guaranteeing both teams at least one possession no matter what. The change was a direct response to playoff heartbreak, a concession that the coin toss could no longer wield such disproportionate power. Still, even with reforms, overtime remains one of the most polarizing aspects of the NFL. Critics argue that sudden death, even in its modified form, undermines the essence of competition. Supporters counter that overtime must remain finite, that games cannot stretch endlessly in pursuit of perfect balance. The rule, like so many others in football, is a compromise between drama and fairness, between tradition and adaptation. What the overtime debate reveals is something larger about the NFL. It is a league perpetually caught between spectacle and justice, between the raw unpredictability that makes football thrilling and the structured fairness demanded by modern audiences. Sudden death was once celebrated as the ultimate test of resolve. Today, it is remembered as a relic of an era when chance overshadowed skill. And yet, the legacy of sudden death cannot be dismissed. It produced some of the most unforgettable moments in football history. Walk-off field goals, improbable touchdowns, and heartbreaks seared into memory. Those moments, unfair as they may have been, are part of the game's mythology. They remind us that football is not only about strategy and execution, but also about fate, luck, and the cruel hand of chance. Overtime has always been a mirror of football itself, imperfect, dramatic, and fiercely debated. The fight for fair endings continues, shaped by rule changes, data, and the voices of players and fans who demand that championships not be decided by a coin flip. But while overtime sparked debates about fairness and chance, another controversial rule arose from a very different source, one not about endings, but about beginnings. Because at the heart of football as drama lies one deceptively simple question: what does it truly mean to catch the ball? Few rules in football inspire as much fury, confusion, and endless debate as the one that defines the simplest act in the game: catching the ball. On the surface, it should be straightforward. A receiver runs his route, the quarterback throws a spiral, the receiver secures it, and the crowd roars. But in the NFL, nothing is ever that simple. For decades, the league has wrestled with the precise definition of a catch. The stakes couldn't be higher. Touchdowns, playoff berths. Even championships have turned not on who was faster, stronger, or smarter, but on whether a referee ruled that a catch was really a catch. The controversy is not new. It's woven into the fabric of the NFL's modern history. With moments so infamous, they've earned nicknames. The Calvin Johnson Rule, Dez Caught It, and countless others that fans still argue about years later. The origins of confusion. In the early decades of professional football, a catch was judged by the eye test. Did the receiver grab the ball? Did it stay in his hands when he hit the ground? Referees relied on instinct, and the game moved forward. But as television broadcasts improved, slow-motion replays began to expose just how messy those judgments could be. What looked like a catch at full speed sometimes didn't hold up when viewed frame by frame. The NFL responded by codifying the rule. A receiver, the league declared, must demonstrate control of the ball, get 2 feet or another body part in bounds, and maintain possession throughout the process of going to the ground. That last phrase, the process of going to the ground, became the most notorious clause in the NFL's rulebook. The Calvin Johnson Play 2010, the controversy exploded on September 12, 2010. The Detroit Lions trailed the Chicago Bears late in the fourth quarter, when quarterback Sean Hill lofted a pass to Calvin Megatron Johnson in the end zone. Johnson leaped above 2 defenders, secured the ball, and landed firmly with 2 feet down. As he fell, he placed the ball on the turf, almost as if spiking it in celebration. The official signaled touchdown. The Lions thought they had one. Then came the review. After agonizing over slow-motion replay, officials overturned the call. By rule, Johnson had not completed the process of the catch. He had not maintained control when the ball touched the ground, even though the play looked like a catch to everyone watching. The Bears won, and outrage erupted. Fans and commentators lambasted the league for turning common sense into nonsense. Thus was born the Calvin Johnson Rule. Dez Bryant and the playoffs 2015. If Johnson's play ignited the debate, Dez Bryant's cemented it. In January 2015, the Dallas Cowboys faced the Green Bay Packers in the NFC Divisional Playoff. Trailing late, Tony Romo launched a deep pass on 4th down to Bryant, who made a spectacular grab over cornerback Sam Shields. Bryant came down near the goal line, lunged forward, and extended the ball toward the end zone. It was a play that seemed destined to live in highlight reels. The referees initially ruled it a catch, then Green Bay challenged. After review, the ruling was overturned. According to the NFL, Bryant hadn't secured the ball through the process of going to the ground. The Cowboys' comeback was halted, and the Packers advanced. The uproar was seismic. Players, coaches, and fans accused the league of robbing Dallas, not just of a game, but of a shot at the Super Bowl. Dez caught it. Became a rallying cry, echoed in sports bars, living rooms, and even congressional hearings where the infamous call was jokingly referenced. Why the rule was so problematic at the heart of the controversy was language. What did it mean to complete the process of the catch? How could fans, players, and even referees interpret the same play so differently? The NFL had tried to use precise legalese to clarify the rule, but instead created a system where technicalities outweighed common sense. Football is a game of instinct. Viewers expect to know a catch when they see one. Yet the league's rule often defied intuition, creating situations where breathtaking athletic plays were nullified on a technicality. The frustration grew as replay technology magnified every wobble, every fingertip adjustment, turning art into a courtroom debate. The NFL's attempts at fixes by 2018, the league could no longer ignore the uproar. The competition committee, under pressure from owners, players, and fans, voted to rewrite the catch rule. The new definition stripped away the dreaded going to the ground clause. A catch, they declared, required 3 things: control of the ball, 2 feet or another body part, in bounds. A football move, such as a third step, reaching for the line to gain, or an act that demonstrated intent to advance. The change was hailed as a victory for common sense. Under the new rule, both Calvin Johnson's and Dez Bryant's catches would have stood. For many, this was vindication years too late. Lingering questions, even with reforms, debates continue. What exactly qualifies as a football move? If a receiver bobbles the ball for a split second, is that still control? In an age where games are decided by millimeters and milliseconds, no rule can eliminate controversy entirely. Consider the 2019 NFC Championship game, where Saints tight end Ben Watson appeared to catch and fumble a pass, only for officials to rule it incomplete. Or the countless borderline plays where a receiver's toe grazes chalk. The ball shifts slightly in his hands, or contact with the ground complicates everything. The NFL's catch rule remains one of the most scrutinized aspects of the game. A reminder that the sport's beauty often lies in its imperfections. The broader meaning beyond the technicalities, the catch rule symbolizes something larger about the NFL's struggle with clarity and fairness. In an era of high-definition broadcasts, billions in betting money, and global audiences, the league cannot afford ambiguity. Every call is dissected on Twitter, replayed on YouTube, and debated by analysts. The pressure to get it right has never been greater. And yet, the catch rule shows that perfection may be impossible. No matter how detailed the definition, football is played in chaos. Bodies colliding, hands fighting for control, athletes stretching physics to its limits. Sometimes, what looks like a catch simply defies words. Why it resonates with fans? The catch is the most basic act of football. From backyard games to the Super Bowl, kids and professionals alike dream of snagging the winning touchdown. When the league complicates that dream with jargon and overturned calls, fans feel robbed. They aren't just watching a game. They're watching the essence of football being rewritten in real time. That's why Dez Caught It still resonates years later. It's not just about Dallas or Green Bay. It's about the belief that the league must honor the spirit of the game over technical minutia. It's about trust between fans and the NFL. A trust shaken every time a highlight-worthy play is erased by legal interpretation. A rule still in motion. The catch rule has been revised, simplified, and reinterpreted. But it remains a living document, one that evolves with the game itself. As offenses grow more creative, as receivers push the limits of athleticism, and as replay technology becomes more precise, the definition of a catch will continue to be tested. The debates won't stop. They are part of football's mythology, reminders that the game is not just about brute force, but also about the fine lines between control and chaos, certainty and doubt. In the end, the catch rule reflects the NFL's eternal balancing act between the spectacle fans crave and the fairness they demand, between the simplicity of the backyard and the complexity of the billion-dollar league. And while the league's lawyers and committees wrestle with words, another controversy has always loomed nearby. One not about who caught the ball, but about who hit too hard after it was caught. If the catch rule reveals the struggle to define possession, the next chapter reveals the struggle to define violence itself. There are rules that clarify possession, rules that measure yards, and rules that manage the clock. But none strike at the soul of football more than those that define how a player is allowed to hit another. At the heart of the NFL's identity lies contact, the violent collision of speed, muscle, and will. For decades, the league glorified those hits. They filled highlight reels, sold VHS tapes, and defined entire eras. But as the science of brain trauma grew impossible to ignore, those same collisions became a moral crisis. Few rules embody that crisis more than the attempts to legislate targeting and helmet-to-helmet contact. To understand why, you have to see how the league long walked the line between spectacle and safety, and how eventually that line blurred into scandal. The early culture of violence for much of its history, the NFL made no secret of its appetite for brutality. Defensive legends like Jack Tatum, nicknamed the Assassin, built careers on hits so punishing they became folklore. Tatum's 1978 collision with Darryl Stingley in a preseason game left Stingley paralyzed for life. Yet the league did little to change the rules. Stingley became a cautionary tale, but not a turning point. In the 1970s and 1980s, the NFL leaned into the violence, marketing it as proof of toughness. By the 1990s, violence was a brand. The NFL's greatest hits tapes, sold by the league itself, glorified bone-rattling tackles and helmet-to-helmet blows, often set to rock soundtracks. Players were celebrated, not penalized, for knocking opponents unconscious. The concussion reckoning, everything changed as the science caught up. In 2002, Dr. Bennett Omalo, a forensic pathologist, published research on chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, after examining the brain of Hall of Famer Mike Webster. His findings were damning. Repeated head trauma caused long-term degenerative brain disease. The NFL resisted, downplayed, and at times discredited the research. But players kept collapsing, kept forgetting, kept dying too young. By the 2010s, a class action lawsuit from thousands of former players forced the league to pay more than $1 billion in settlements. The NFL could no longer market helmet-to-helmet hits as entertainment. It had to treat them as existential threats. Birth of the targeting rule. College football acted first. In 2013, the NCAA introduced a targeting rule. If a player launched at an opponent with the crown of the helmet or made forcible contact to the head or neck area of a defenseless player, he was ejected. The NFL resisted adopting a direct equivalent, fearing that automatic ejections would alter its product too drastically. But it tightened its own guidelines, instituting penalties and fines for helmet-to-helmet hits. The rule was clear in principle: protect players from unnecessary head trauma. In practice, it was anything but clear. The gray areas football is played at full speed, in fractions of a second. A receiver leaps for a ball, and at the same instant, a defender lowers his shoulder. Helmets collide. Was it intentional? Was the defender targeting the head, or did the receiver duck at the last instant? Officials often had to make those calls on instinct. Fans accused them of softening the sport. Defenders felt handcuffed, arguing that physics made perfect form impossible at full speed. Offenses, meanwhile, learned to exploit the rules, baiting penalties by putting players in vulnerable positions. The culture war was immediate. Traditionalists accused the league of sanitizing football. Safety advocates insisted the changes were overdue and incomplete. Players themselves were divided, caught between their instinct to hit and their desire to preserve their own futures. Case studies and controversy, one of the most infamous incidents came in the 2017 AFC Championship, when Patriots receiver Brandon Cooks was knocked unconscious by a crushing helmet-to-helmet hit. The play wasn't flagged, but replays circulated endlessly, fueling outrage over whether the rules were being applied consistently. In 2019, Raiders linebacker Vontaze Burfict, long notorious for violent play, was suspended for the entire season after a helmet-to-helmet hit on Colts tight end Jack Doyle. It was the harshest penalty in league history for such a violation, signaling that the NFL was prepared to treat repeat offenders as existential risks to the league's image. Yet inconsistency remained the rule. Some hits drew ejections, others only minor penalties. Fans complained of confusion. Players complained of unpredictability. So the Helmet Rule 2018 to resolve the ambiguity. The NFL unveiled its helmet rule in 2018. Any player who initiated contact with the crown of his helmet could be flagged, regardless of the target. The idea was simple: eliminate the most dangerous collisions at their source. But again, the application proved messy. Preseason games that year were littered with penalties, some on routine tackles. Commentators feared the game was becoming unrecognizable. Defensive players argued that the league was asking them to unlearn instincts built since childhood. The broader struggle at its core, the targeting debate, isn't just about rules. It's about identity. Football, unlike basketball or baseball, sells violence as part of its DNA. Fans cheer hardest when a receiver is flattened across the middle, or when a safety delivers a crushing blow. Taking that out of the game feels to some like stripping it of its essence. And yet, the evidence of brain trauma is undeniable. Every helmet-to-helmet collision is not just a spectacle, but a potential scar on the brain. Every replay of a limp player on the turf reminds fans of the long-term cost. The NFL has tried to straddle the line, instituting fines, adjusting rules, tweaking language, but the tension persists. The human cost behind every rule change is a story of loss. Darryl Stingley never walked again after that hit in 1978. Junior Seau, a Hall of Fame linebacker, took his own life in 2012. His brain showed severe CTE. Dozens of other players, men who sacrificed their bodies for the game, have endured dementia, depression, or early death. The targeting rule may be imperfect, but it is born of necessity. It represents the league's attempt, however flawed, to honor those sacrifices by preventing future ones. What it means for the future: will the NFL ever adopt the NCAA's automatic ejection rule? Will helmets be redesigned to reduce trauma further? Will tackling itself be fundamentally altered in the name of safety? These questions linger over every offseason. What's clear is that the battle over targeting and helmet-to-helmet hits is not just about penalties. It's about whether football can reconcile its violent past with a safer future. The controversy surrounding targeting reveals how deeply the league struggles with its own image, torn between tradition and survival, between the roar of the crowd and the silent suffering of its veterans. And as much as targeting tests the boundaries of violence, another controversial rule tests the very rhythm of the sport itself. If targeting asks how hard you can hit, overtime asks how long the game should go, and whether fairness truly exists when everything is on the line. In football, every play is a war of inches. Every drive feels like a season compressed into a handful of minutes. And every game, at its heart, is supposed to provide resolution. A clear winner, a clear loser, a story with an ending. But for decades, one of the most controversial aspects of the NFL has been how games end when 60 minutes isn't enough. The overtime rule, born from necessity, shaped by television, and battered by controversy, is a reminder that in football, fairness is often a moving target. The origins of sudden death. The NFL first introduced sudden death overtime in 1946 for a playoff game between the Giants and the Redskins. Before that, tied games were simply accepted. But ties frustrated fans and muddled standings. By 1958, when the Baltimore Colts faced the New York Giants in what came to be known as the greatest game ever played, sudden death made its mark on history. That December day, in front of a national television audience, the Colts and Giants battled into overtime for the first time in NFL playoff history. Alan Amici's one-yard touchdown plunge ended the game, giving the Colts the championship and cementing sudden death as part of the NFL's identity. The drama was electric, the ratings historic. The league saw its future. For decades, sudden death remained untouched. The first team to score any points in overtime, field goal, touchdown, or even safety. It sounded fair enough. Until it wasn't. The coin toss problem, the longer sudden death remained, the clearer its flaw became. Overtime often turned not on grit or strategy, but on the randomness of a coin toss. Win the toss, get the ball first, drive far enough for a field goal. And the game was over before your opponent touched the ball. The numbers told the story. Between 1974 and 2011, nearly 60% of teams that won the coin toss in overtime went on to win the game. In the playoffs, where stakes were highest, the imbalance felt intolerable. A playoff controversy that changed everything. The breaking point came in January 2010, during the NFC Championship. The New Orleans Saints faced the Minnesota Vikings. After a brutal physical regulation, the game went to overtime. The Saints won the coin toss. They marched into field goal range. Garrett Hartley kicked a 40-yarder, and just like that, the game was over. The Vikings, led by Brett Favre, in what many believed was his last best chance at another Super Bowl, never touched the ball. Fans, players, and media erupted in anger. How could a game of such magnitude end without giving both teams a chance? The rule change of 2012, the NFL responded. Beginning with the 2012 postseason, the sudden death rule was modified. A field goal on the first possession would no longer end the game. Only a touchdown or a defensive score on the opening drive could end the game immediately. The change was hailed as a step toward fairness. Yet even this compromise left cracks. In regular season games, sudden death with field goals still existed until 2017, when the league fully extended the modified rule to every game. The Chiefs-Patriots AFC Championship 2019. If the Saints-Vikings game triggered reform, the 2019 AFC Championship reignited outrage. Tom Brady's Patriots and Patrick Mahomes' Chiefs delivered a classic shootout. Regulation ended tied. Overtime began. The Patriots won the coin toss, marched downfield, and scored a touchdown. The Chiefs never had the ball. Fans demanded change. Mahomes himself voiced his frustration. "I never had a chance," he said, echoing the sentiment of millions. Once again, the NFL's overtime rule, designed for drama, felt instead like injustice. The Bills-Chiefs playoff epic 2022. The debate reached its fever pitch in January 2022. In the AFC Divisional Playoff, the Buffalo Bills and Kansas City Chiefs staged one of the most thrilling finishes in NFL history. In the final 2 minutes of regulation, the teams combined for 25 points. Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes seemed locked in a duel that could have gone on forever. But when overtime began, fate, or the coin, intervened. Kansas City won the toss. Mahomes led a march down the field. A touchdown ended it. Josh Allen, after throwing for 4 touchdowns and playing the game of his life, never touched the ball in overtime. The outrage was immediate, universal, and deafening. Players, coaches, and analysts called the rule unfair. Fans took to social media demanding change. The NFL could not ignore the chorus. The latest evolution in March 2022, the NFL approved a new overtime rule for postseason games. Both teams must have at least one possession, regardless of what happens on the opening drive. If the score is still tied after both teams touch the ball, the game reverts to sudden death. It was a compromise, but it restored at least a sense of balance to the playoffs. Regular season games, however, retained the older format, with only one guaranteed possession if the first drive ended in a field goal. Critics argued that 2 sets of rules, one for the regular season and one for the playoffs, created confusion and inconsistency. Still, it was progress. Fairness versus tradition. The overtime debate reveals the NFL's constant balancing act. Fans crave drama. Sudden death offers the ultimate thrill. One play, one drive, one mistake can decide it all. But drama without fairness feels hollow. How can a league that thrives on competition justify denying one of its teams the chance to compete in overtime? And yet, perfection remains elusive. Extending games with guaranteed possessions risks fatigue, injury, and broadcast conflicts. A college-style shootout where each team alternates possessions from the 25-yard line might satisfy fans, but feels foreign to the NFL's identity. So the league continues to tweak, compromise, and argue, a process as endless as overtime itself. Why it matters, the overtime controversy isn't just about coin tosses and touchdowns. It's about what the NFL stands for. Is the league a pure competition where fairness is paramount? Or is it an entertainment product where drama takes precedence? The overtime rule, more than any other, forces that question into the spotlight. Every time a playoff game ends with one quarterback on the sideline, helmet in hand, never getting his chance, fans are reminded that football's greatest drama often comes not from who wins, but how. From sudden death to the future. From Amici's plunge in 1958 to Josh Allen's heartbreak in 2022. Overtime has told the story of football's evolution. From spectacle to scrutiny, from simplicity to complexity, from unquestioned tradition to constant reform. And as the league continues to grow, fueled by billions in broadcast revenue and millions of fans worldwide, overtime will remain a litmus test. For fairness, for drama, for the very soul of the sport. The overtime debate closes the circle of controversial NFL rules. From catches to targeting, from fair catches to coin tosses, each story reflects the same truth. Football is not just a game of rules, but of meaning. The rules don't just define the sport. They reveal its values, its contradictions, and its struggles to balance spectacle with justice. The story of controversial rules is, in the end, the story of the NFL itself. A league forever caught between the game it once was and the game it is still trying to become. Football has always been more than a game. For millions, it is ritual and theater, violence and artistry, discipline and chaos. It is the crack of helmets on Sunday afternoons, the roar of fans filling stadiums, and the sight of ordinary men performing extraordinary acts. But beneath the spectacle lies a darker truth. The game has never stopped wrestling with itself. At its heart, the story of the NFL is not just touchdowns and trophies, but rules that reveal its deepest contradictions, its attempts at survival, and its struggle to define what it truly values. Over these chapters, we've traced the origins and consequences of the league's most controversial rules. From the brutal days of the early 1900s, when reform was demanded to save lives, to the gray areas of modern replay, targeting, and overtime, one theme has remained constant. Football's identity is always in flux. Rules are never just technical adjustments. They are reflections of culture, of business, of morality. The constant tension between safety and spectacle. Consider the targeting debate. On paper, it is about head contact. Crown of the helmet, defenseless receivers. In reality, it is about the very soul of football. For decades, the league marketed violence as its selling point. The biggest hits were glorified, replayed endlessly, and turned into merchandise. Yet, as medical science exposed the devastating toll on players, bodies, and minds, the NFL faced a reckoning. Could it continue to celebrate the very collisions that were destroying its athletes? The targeting rule, with all its controversy, is proof of how far the league has been forced to bend. It is also proof of how resistant it remains. For every helmet-to-helmet flag, there are fans who boo, analysts who criticize, and defenders who feel unfairly punished. The rulebook has tried to thread an impossible needle, to protect players while preserving the essence of a violent game. That contradiction may never be resolved. The quest for fairness is another constant undercurrent. The catch rule was never just about whether a player held onto the ball. It was about whether fans could trust their eyes. When Dez Bryant's miracle grab was erased by legalistic jargon, it wasn't just the Cowboys who felt robbed. It was every fan who had ever believed in the purity of the game. Overtime, too, has been shaped by this pursuit of fairness. For decades, sudden death enthralled audiences. But as the stakes grew higher, the flaws became harder to ignore. Championship dreams were decided not by the skill of quarterbacks or defenses, but by the flip of a coin. The NFL has reformed the rule, but the debate never truly ends. Each new controversy renews the question: what does it mean for a sport to be fair? Football may never find a perfect answer, but the pursuit itself, the willingness to adapt, has been the league's quiet acknowledgement that fairness matters, even when it collides with tradition. The business of rules are not made in a vacuum. They are made under the pressure of television networks, advertisers, and billions of dollars at stake. The NFL's embrace of replay in the 1980s wasn't just about accuracy. It was about credibility, about ensuring that fans could trust what they saw on their screens. The revisions to overtime in 2012 and 2022 weren't only about fairness. They were about protecting the league's image from the backlash of angry fan bases. Every controversial rule tells a business story as much as a football story. The league knows that perception is power. It's a sense of justice, of clarity, of balance, even if imperfect, keeps audiences invested. In this way, the NFL's rulebook is as much a public relations document as it is a manual of competition. The human stories behind the rules, what makes the history of these rules resonate, are the human lives they touch. Darryl Stingley, paralyzed after a hit in 1978, forced fans to confront the cost of violence. Calvin Johnson, robbed of a highlight that should have defined his career, reminded us how language in a rulebook can distort the spirit of the game. Josh Allen, standing helpless on the sideline in 2022, became the face of every player denied a chance at glory because of a coin toss. Rules are not abstract. They're lived in bodies and careers, in triumphs and heartbreaks. They shape legacies. They alter histories. Tradition versus evolution. What ties all of this together is the eternal battle between tradition and evolution. football thrives on its mythology. The toughness of the 1970s Steelers, the dynasties of Lombardi and Belichick, the idea that nothing should change in a game built on sacrifice. Yet football has also survived because it has changed. The forward pass was once radical, so was replay, so was moving the goalpost. Every generation of fans insists that reform threatens the sport's essence, and every generation of fans eventually accepts the new normal. Controversial rules are the markers of these transitions. They are the growing pains of a game trying to honor its past while securing its future. What the rules teach us about the NFL in the end. The NFL's controversial rules reveal a truth that is both unsettling and hopeful. They show a league that is reactive, often more concerned with optics than principle. They show a league willing to bend only when forced by outrage, tragedy, or financial necessity. But they also show a league that refuses to stand still, one that evolves under pressure, even if slowly, even if imperfectly. This duality, cynical yet adaptive, flawed yet resilient, mirrors the contradictions of America itself. The NFL is a reflection of the culture that sustains it, obsessed with fairness but fueled by spectacle, yearning for justice but unwilling to abandon tradition, captivated by violence yet haunted by its cost. The legacy of controversial rules. When future generations look back, they may not remember the exact wording of the catch rule or the precise year over time was amended. What they will remember are the moments. Calvin Johnson slamming the ball in frustration, Des Bryant pleading with referees, Josh Allen staring into the void. They will remember the debates, the outrage, the endless replays dissected frame by frame. And perhaps they will see in those controversies the larger story of football. A game forever caught between chaos and order, brutality and fairness, entertainment and ethics. A final reflection. As I reflect on the dark past of these rules, I see not just the flaws of the NFL, but its humanity. The game is imperfect because we are imperfect. We crave violence but recoil at its consequences. We demand fairness but accept chance when it benefits us. We cheer for tradition but demand change when tradition becomes unbearable. The NFL's rules are not just technicalities. They are moral documents. They ask, how much violence are we willing to tolerate? How much fairness do we demand? How much of the game are we willing to sacrifice in the name of safety, or justice, or clarity? Those questions do not have final answers. They will be asked again with the next controversy, the next tragic injury, the next playoff heartbreak. And in that way, the rules themselves become part of football's ongoing story, not its background, but its heart. The dark past of the NFL's controversial rules is not just history, it is prophecy. It tells us that the league will continue to stumble, to reform, to argue, to adapt. It tells us that every Sunday, when players step onto the field, they are not just playing a game within the rules. They are shaping what those rules will become. And maybe that is football's greatest truth, that even in its contradictions, its controversies, its darkest chapters, it continues to capture us. Not because it is perfect, but because it is endlessly human.